So today the feast of St. Lawrence, and he'll be here again in Goulburn. And the epistle for this feast of St. Lawrence taking that of St. Paul out of Corinthians, chapter 9. Brethren, he who soweth sparingly shall also reap sparingly, and he who soweth in blessings shall reap in blessings. Everyone as he hath determined in his heart, not with sadness or necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound in you, that ye always, having all sufficiency in all things, may abound to every good work. As it is written, He hath dispersed abroad, He hath given to the poor, His justice remaineth forever. And he that administereth seed to the sower, will both give you bread to eat, and multiply your seed, and increase the growth of the fruits of your justice. And then the Gospel. Taking that according to St. John chapter 12. At that time Jesus said to his disciples, Amen, amen, I say unto you, unless to the grain of wheat falling to the ground die, it remaineth itself alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world keepeth it unto a life eternal. If any man minister unto me, let him follow me, and where I am, there also my minister shall be. And if any man minister me, him will my Father honor. Thus are the words of today's Holy Gospel. Today, a few considerations on St. Lawrence. St. Augustine says, there are many wonderful martyrs, there are many wonderful saints, but Lawrence holds a most sacred and most special place. To him is attributed the conversion of the city of Rome, and that he died in Rome by the hand of Decius, and that he was a deacon, and he was an archdeacon, and he was archdeacon in many dioceses, but since his time he was considered such the greatest of the archdeacons that from that moment on there would no longer be an archdeacon for the Pope. He would be the last archdeacon. That says, so that St. Lawrence and St. Stephen hold a special place. The duty of the deacon is to preach. That's the duty of the deacon. He is to minister at the tables. And there are no more perfect deacons than St. Stephen, the first of the martyrs, and then St. Lawrence, the greatest of all the deacons. And he lived around 250, 260 A.D., and he was at that time in Rome, and the Decius was a general. Decius was a general in the army of the emperor, and he was sent to fight in the north. He fought and won battles, and then he killed the emperor. But the emperor Philip, his son also with the same name, he had the money and treasures that belonged properly to the emperor, and he became a Christian, and therefore he took the money that he had and he gave it to Saint Sixtus, the Pope. He said, Sixtus, take this money and take care of it. Take this treasure and give it to the poor. And so Sixtus took the treasure. When Decius returned to Rome, he used bribes and so on to get the people of Rome to accept him as the new emperor, or Caesar, not emperor but Caesar. They accept him as a Caesar and as the leader of the Roman people, and he wanted to find out where that money was. And he heard that Sixtus had the money. Sixtus had the treasures of Philip. So he went and found Sixtus. He sent soldiers down. They found out that he was saying Mass in the catacombs. The catacomb of St. Sixtus, named after him after that time. He went into the catacomb of St. Sixtus, now called the catacomb of St. Sixtus, and he went in, and Deacon Lawrence was serving his Mass. The soldiers came and threw Lawrence aside, and they grabbed Sixtus and they took him off to be martyred. And as he was being taken off to be martyred, Lawrence followed behind. And Lawrence there was with the soldiers, and he was speaking to Sixtus, and he says, "Oh great priest, how can you go to the sacrifice without your deacon? How can you offer the sacrifice? For if I am not worthy, if you consider me worthy to stand at the altar, you consider me worthy to stand at the altar of the sacrifice of the Mass, then do you no longer consider me worthy to be sacrificed and martyrdom with you?" And he followed behind. And the soldiers threw him aside because they were in instruction, take Sixtus, he's the one that has the money. And they gathered Sixtus, and Lawrence kept trying to get himself captured by the soldiers. And he followed behind and followed behind. And he said therefore to Sixtus, you are the one who offers the sacrifice. How can you offer it, the sacrifice of the blood of Christ, without your deacon? How can you go to your own blood without the blood of the deacon being with you? And Saint Sixtus turned to Lawrence, and he says, I am an old man. I will go quickly to my death. But do not worry, Lawrence. You shall pass. You shall be also come after me in 3 days. And you shall have a much greater glory than I. For you are a young man, and it is given to the young men to fight the noble fight, and given to the young men to have the greatest glory. And so let me go to my death, and you will go to a greater death and a greater glory. And Sixtus was then taken in and being tortured. And on the 3rd day, when Sixtus himself was martyred, he was on his way to martyrdom, and before he went on, he instructed Lawrence to take all the money that remained and give it all to the poor. So he did take all the money. He was in charge of the money, and unlike Judas, he took the money and he gave it to the poor, and he ministered only for the welfare of the church. And Lawrence therefore went and he ministered all the money, gave it to all the poor, and washed their wounds and healed many of them, some of them blind. He cured them of their blindness, and then he handed out all the money to the poor. When Sixtus was on his way to his final martyrdom, the soldiers were carrying Sixtus to be martyred, and he said, and Lawrence spent each day and each night of the last 3 days giving away all the things the church had. Everything the church had, he gave it all away to the poor. And he said, I've given everything away. There's nothing left to be given. Therefore, let me go to you to death. And they heard him mention the word money, and they grabbed him, and they brought him before Decius. And Decius then said to him, where have you hidden the treasures? The treasures that belong to me. The treasures that belong to Rome. There are treasures. Where have you hidden them? You know where they lie hid. And then St. Lawrence said, all right, I'll give me 3 days, and I shall gather together all the treasures and show you what treasures are. So then Lawrence went, and he gathered together all the poor that he had given the money to. And he gathered the poor and the indigent of Rome, and he brought them before the emperor, the Caesar Decius. And he said, Decius, after the 3rd day, behold, these are the treasures. And if you want to see where your treasures are, behold their hands. And he told the poor, show your hands to the king. And they showed their hands, and behold their hands. They have taken all the treasures. They have taken all the money, and they have carried it to heaven. And if you want the treasure, you must go to heaven. And you must go and find this treasure in heaven. And Decius was exceedingly angry, and he began the first martyrdom of Lawrence, beating him with stones and torturing him and mocking him. And then he told Lawrence, Lawrence, you must offer incense to the idols. And he looked at the idol and he said, who am I supposed to worship? That piece of rock or the one that made it? Tell me which one to worship. And the emperor became very angry at the mockery of Lawrence, and so he began to beat him with stones, and he began to torture him very slowly. And then Lawrence said to him, I thank you for this banquet, for you call these things pain, I call them delicacies, and these are the joys in which I have always desired, for this is what I desire, to suffer like my Lord. And he became more and more constant and more strong, and his face became filled with a greater joy. And he went to die several times. And several different times he said, Lord, I give up my ghost, and I will take me into thy arms. And an angel came down and said, no, it is not time for you to die, Lawrence, for you must suffer many more trials for Christ. And he was given strength again, and he was tortured again. And over a very long period he was tortured, until finally the final torture of the emperor Statius the Caesar, was to take him and put him roast him on the gridiron. They took the iron and roasted him on the iron, and he was burnt by the fire for a very long time. And so therefore, he said, O emperor, you wicked emperor, this fire is to me comfort, this fire is to me joy, this fire is to me my salvation. But this fire you shall not escape, for you shall eternally burn in fire. This fire that is joy to me shall be thy eternal torments. And the emperor was exceedingly more angry with him. And then he said his famous lines that all know about St. Lawrence. He said that the meat is not yet cooked. He mocked the guards. He mocked the fire. He mocked the heat. And he filled only with the divine love. And during the course of this time, he was dying. He was brought back in prison. He was dying. He converted each of his guards, baptized all of their families, received them into the church. And then St. Hippolytus Romanus, whose feast was yesterday, and several others all went to martyrdom following him. And Hippolytus would be martyred after him. Hippolytus was his present guard. And the emperor, he was one who would bury and hide the body of Lawrence so that it would be preserved. And so that we have the body of Lawrence to this day. Then Hippolytus himself then was martyred at the very end. And St. Augustine speaks about Lawrence. And he says, Lawrence is the great saint. For he gives us the tools and he gives us the method to understand how to be a saint, how to be a martyr. How is a martyr made? And what is it that it was a great victory of St. Lawrence? Lawrence knew the great treasures of the church. And he took the treasures, and that's why it says in the Mass today, it was chosen by the Holy Church. And he's the only martyr that has a vigil. And Jacobus tells us that there is a vigil of St. Lawrence, but not a fast. Because in the olden times, all of the feasts, most of the feasts, the many feasts of the saints did have vigils. But because of corruption, because of people gathering together with the vigils and committing sins, rather than gathering together to pray, the vigils were replaced with a fast. So the vigils were stopped by vigils of prayer to fast. But Lawrence, because of his wonder and his greatness, his vigil was not turned into a fast, but kept only as a vigil. The last of the vigils, of the early vigils, to remain as a vigil, because of the greatness of St. Lawrence. But it says here in the book of St. Paul says to the Corinthians, he who soweth sparingly, he shall also reap sparingly. But he that soweth in blessings, he shall reap in blessings. And everyone has, as he hath determined in his heart, not with sad necessity, but for the love of God, be a cheerful giver. For God loveth a cheerful giver. But who soweth in blessings shall reap in blessings. And St. Augustine says, he sowed in the greatest of blessings, did Lawrence. Lawrence showed in the greatest of all blessings. Why? First of all, he loved only the holy sacrifice of the Mass. And he saw the Mass as the place where Jesus Christ dies in an unbloody manner, and where he is united to the death and blood of Christ, and God shed every drop of his blood. And he recognized in this blood of the Mass. We all go to the holy sacrifice of the Mass. But what did Lawrence see when he went to the Holy Mass? He never celebrated one Mass in his life. All he was a deacon. And in the holy sacrifice of the Mass, the deacon has one sacred moment in the Mass, where at the offertory, he takes his hand and he puts it on the chalice. And the priest raises up the chalice to offer it to God. And he puts his hand under the chalice and he says with the priest, Oferimus tibi Domini collegium salutaris accipiam. Or we offer to thee, O Lord, the chalice of salvation. We offer. That's why even now when I say the Mass of myself without a deacon, we always say the word Oferimus. Oferimus does not refer to the priest and the faithful. It refers to the priest and the deacon. The deacon is now close to the priesthood. He's almost able to offer the sacrifice. And what is he going to do? He's going to put his hand under the chalice during the offertory. And he's going to let us offer. And then he's going to have the power to carry Christ from the tabernacle to the souls and give them Holy Communion. He's going to have the power to perform marriages, to unite, to bring souls to Christ. He's going to have the power to preach. Because when he preaches, he's supposed to carry that Christ to souls. And he's supposed to move souls to go to Christ. He's a mover of the Blessed Sacrament. That's the duty of the deacon. The deacon does not make Christ present. The deacon carries Christ. The deacon carries Christ to souls. And if Christ cannot be carried to souls, he then carries souls to Christ. And everything is about carrying Christ. Hence, the essence of the deacon is that he is a man of charity. And then when St. Lawrence was at the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, which he had never celebrated once in his life, he put his hand under the chalice and said the only prayer that he's able to say during the Mass, Offeremus ibi Domini calicem. Let us offer to thee, O Lord, this chalice. And everywhere he went, he offered the chalice. He was filled with a great charity, and he poured out his whole being. And what did he want to do? Pour out his blood. So that when the soldiers came to capture St. Sixtus, Lawrence said, how can you go and offer? You offer the chalice with me? Why can you not be offered in blood with me? And so he went. But it was not to suffer with Sixtus, but to suffer alone, so that he would have a greater martyrdom than any of the other martyrs. None suffered as long as he. So many times he should have died in his martyrdom, but the angel kept bringing him back to life to suffer more. And he had a greater constancy and a greater joy. Yet he was very slowly roasted. Very slowly roasted. He was stretched upon the fire, says St. Augustine. He was stretched upon the fire so that his whole body would burn. And many of the other saints, they lifted their hands to God, but he was stretched upon the fire, and his whole body glowed with the love of God. And he poured his love into God. And there are 5 fires that he defeated, says Jacobus. St. Augustine, in a sermon concerning the greatness of Lawrence, says he defeated 5 fires. The first fire is the fire of hell. He defeated that fire by keeping his faith and staying in grace. He defeated the fire of hell. And secondly, he defeated the material fire. Remember, St. Joan of Arc was afraid of the fire. And she had to grab a great courage from the angels in order to be able to overcome that fear of the material fire. And this fire also is a little type of the fire that is in the fire of hell. And he overcame that fire, the fire which causes the greatest pain that a man can experience in this life. He overcame the material fire. And then thirdly, he overcame the fire of lust, the fire of concupiscence. For these are fires that burn inside of the soul, the fire of concupiscence. And then the fourth fire that he defeated was the fire of greed. We do not see St. Augustine says, consider greed as a fire. It burns inside of the soul. When our Lord Jesus Christ came into this world, he said, I have willed that the world be set on fire, and what will I but it be enkindled? For there is a fire that burns that we want to. Fire always is looking for oxygen. Fire is always looking for fuel. Fire is always looking for something to consume, and fire is always trying to spread itself. That's the nature of fire. And fire is alive. Well, there's a fire of hell, there's a material fire, and then there's a fire of lust, and the fire of greed. This fire burns in the heart of man. It is not only the fire of lust, but the fire of greed that burns in the heart of man. And then there is a final fire, which is called the fire of madness. We're going to see this fire more and more in the future. The fire of madness, says St. Augustine. This is the fire of the wrath and anger and hatred and violence of the persecutor. For he is filled with the other fires. The fire of hell burns in him. The fire of greed and the fire of lust burns in him. And when he sees anyone who has a sacred fire, the fire of the divine love, he is filled with the fire of madness, the fire of uncontrollable wrath. This fire is spoken of by Mary of Agreda when she saw the vision in a vision how Caiaphas burnt with this fire. He was filled with the fire of madness. He was filled with such hatred of Christ that he must burn him. He must crucify him. He must destroy him. And the fire overtook his entire being so that he could not think of anything else. The fire of madness is the final fire of the persecutor and the final fire of those filled with great wickedness. And the world is going to be filled with many souls with this fire. We see the signs of this fire in many souls today. You mention Christ. You mention anything good. You mention justice. You speak about any kind of goodness, even such a thing as abortion is murder or homosexuality is evil, and you will see this fire coming out of the eyes of the wicked men. And the fire is more and more the fire that Augustine calls the fire of madness. And this fire of madness is the final fire of the persecutor that he uses to try to terrify the friends of God, to try to get the friends of God to go against God. How are these fires overcome? These 5 external fires. And St. Augustine tells us they're overcome by 6 things, closely related one to another. And the first 3 things are refrigerants that cool down the fires. And the last three things are a fire that burns more than these wicked fires. For we fight fire with fire, is a saying. But the first thing that cools down the sacred fire, or the wicked fire, it is simply the desire for heaven. Desire heaven. Because what is it that's the problem with us? We are in a materialistic society, and we have TV commercials. And TV commercials tell you you have to have the latest can opener. You have to have the latest cell phone. You have to have the latest computer. You have to have the latest and biggest house. You've got to have a bigger swimming pool. You've got to have better car. You've got to have better clothes that are more in style. You've got to have a better this and a better that. These are all things that we desire. And our heart is filled with these foolish desires. And these desires load us down and weigh us down. How are they overcome? Desire heaven. Desire heaven. Many saints in the vision of purgatory say that there is a special place in purgatory for those that do not desire heaven enough. Father Urban Snyder used to mention that in his final sermons before he died. They used to mention there's a place in purgatory for those that do not desire heaven enough. Desire heaven. We must desire heaven. That's the first thing. Souls don't desire heaven. What do we want? When we go to the baptism, and the baby is brought to the church, the priest asks the question, what do you ask of the church of God? Faith. All right, faith. Why do you want faith? What does faith offer to you? Eternal life. Now we can talk. If thou wishest to have eternal life, believe in the God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, one, three persons in one God, and then follow His commandments. But what makes us able to follow His commandments? What makes us able to believe that faith? What makes us keep that faith? The desire for heaven. There must be a desire for heaven. And that's why St. Lawrence was filled with such great joy, because his eyes were fixed on heaven. And when several times during the martyrdom, he spoke to the wicked emperor, and he said, "O Emperor, I am going to my glory, for I am going to meet God, and I will be able to say to God, O God, I have not abandoned you in the face of the persecutor. O God, I have stayed faithful to you, and therefore I go happily to my death." There must be a desire for heaven. We must desire heaven to replace the desire for money, the desire for a bigger house, the desire for possessions, the desire for power. We all have desire in our bloods. And so the first thing is to desire heaven. And then the second thing says, which goes with it, says St. Augustine, the second thing that cools, contemplate the divine law. Contemplate the divine law. Read the lives of the saints. Read the Holy Scriptures. Say the Holy Rosary. And think about the things of God. During the course of the day, speak of God. Contemplate the divine power. Contemplate the divine law. The divine law is in everything. The law of nature. We see that God is the one who made the law of gravitation. God is the one that made the law of how ants operate as ants. He's the one that made the law of trees, and the law of flowers, and the law of the seasons. God made all these laws. Contemplate the divine law. And here we find in the second contemplation the gift of knowledge, by which we see God in things, and see things in God. We simply contemplate these things. Desire heaven, and contemplate the divine power. Contemplate the divine law. And that's the second thing that cools down. And then have a pure and clean conscience. A pure conscience, the third thing, that cools down the fire. Don't be devious, don't be deceptive, don't be maneuvering, don't be trying to angle one way or another, but have a pure and clean conscience like a child. And these three things cool down the fires. The desire for heaven, the contemplation of the divine law, the divine things, and to spend time thinking about those things, which helps fuel our desire for heaven, and have a pure and clean and straight conscience. Then there are three fires. St. Augustine tells us there are three fires that burn inside of Lawrence. These fires burn so much more hot than the external fires. For the fire of hell, and the fire of the material fire by which the emperor used to torture him, and the fire of lust, and the fire of greed, and the fire of madness of the emperor's wrath, of the king's wrath, these fires are external fires, and they are cold, and they do not burn in comparison to the internal fire that burnt inside of Lawrence. And the first fire is the ardor of faith. The ardor of faith. And this goes with the desire for heaven. When we desire heaven, well, how do we get heaven? We go to the baptism. We stand in front of the priest. And the priest says, what do you ask of the church of God? Faith. What does faith offer to you? Eternal life. We desire heaven, and therefore we burn with the fire of faith. The desire of heaven cools the other desires, and the fire of faith burns hotter than the other fires, and it keeps us in the state of grace, the ardor of faith. And the second is the love of Christ. There has to be love. Deus caritas est, the second fire, the fire of the divine love. This fire is tested in persecution. This fire is tested in difficulties. Do we have the fire of the divine love inside of us? What happens when someone attacks us? Here is something that we often do. I gave you $1,000. I gave you a new stroller for your kid. I gave you a car. And now the people become angry. All right, I want my car back. I want my $1,000 back. And this also applies to the church. It applies to the church. How many souls say, well, I gave that statue, I gave that altar, I gave those pews, I gave that money, I gave this, and they have turned against God. Therefore, I want it back. You never gave it to begin with. What is given is given. What is given is given. And the test is, if someone is cruel to you, someone is not grateful to you, someone attacks you, do you still give? Do you still give? We find in the lives of the saints a second ardor that burns. This is the proof that we love God more than things. This is the proof that the desire of heaven is greater than the desire of things. For how do I prove that I love God? Well, I gave him $1,000. I got my name on a plaque that said, you know, Ralph Simpson gave this little bitty brick, and that's my brick. And you come over to see that that's my brick. I gave that brick. I gave that stained glass window. I gave this altar. I did this. I did that. Where is the love? Where is the love? The second ardor is the ardor of love. Love gives in the face of negativity, in the face of attacks. Now when the persecution comes, and they try to kill us, are we going to love then? Who doesn't love in small things cannot love in great things. And hence the second fire that burns, the fire of the love of God. And then, in any case, so these fires, these sacred fires burn. And then the third fire, don't forget what the third fire is, the fire of the sanctifying grace, but the fire of faith, the fire of charity, and the fire of the love of truth. There must be a love of truth, says St. Augustine. That's the third fire. The fire of the love of truth. For St. Lawrence loved truth. He loved the reality. What is the purpose of money? Money is to be used as a tool to attain something else. That's what money is. Money is a tool to attain something else. And he recognizes the truth about money. Why did God give us money? To buy heaven. It's expensive. The rates have gone up. There's inflation every year of your life. And the fact is that heaven is expensive and it must be purchased. It is purchased by giving money to the poor. It is purchased by giving money to the church. It is purchased by giving money to our enemies. It is purchased by using money for the sake of fostering the kingdom of heaven. And Our Lady of Quito said, she did say 400 years ago, there will be many souls lost in the 20th century because of the lack of generosity. That's what she said. There will be many souls that go to hell because of a lack of generosity of the rich. The lack of generosity of the rich. In the richest age it's ever been in the history of the world, the 20th and now 21st century, where there is more wealth amongst the poor than there used to be amongst the rich. And there's more wealthy and the rich than there ever were before. But where is their charity? Where is their pouring out? And here says St. Augustine, where is the love of truth? What is the truth about money? What is the truth about possessions? What is the truth about my things? And the fire of the love of truth burnt inside of St. Lawrence. And hence it destroyed and quenched the other fires. The ardor of faith, the ardor of love, and the ardor of the love of truth. He gives them three different fires that burnt inside of St. Lawrence. These fires must burn inside of us. How do we prepare to become martyrs? There's no greater honor, no greater blessing, no greater joy than can there be to die for the love of Christ, and to die at the hands of the persecutor for the love of Christ. There is no greater joy. It is the greatest gift that God can give. He doesn't even give it to all the saints. And this great gift, how do we prepare for it? It must be prepared for by the desire for heaven. Prepared for by the love of the neighbor, the desire of heaven, the love of the divine law. The second thing St. Augustine says, the love of the divine law. And then a purity of conscience. And these things cool the fires. And it's prepared for by an ardor of faith. How important is our faith? Don't let that faith be harmed. Don't let that faith be diminished. Don't let that faith be attacked. And if we have the ardor of faith, it will burn in charity. It will make us pour ourselves out for the good of our enemies, for the good of our friends, for the good of our family, for the good of those whom we've never met before, and for the spreading of the kingdom of Christ. Because love burns, and it goes out, and fire burns whatever it touches. Fire doesn't burn things. If you're trying to cook meat, fire doesn't go around the steel and cook the meat. Fire burns everything around it. And if we have the fire of love of God in us, it will burn everything around us. The charity will touch everywhere. It will touch everywhere. So that Stephen, the greatest of all the deacons, even greater than Lawrence. And Stephen, what did he do? He said, lay not this sin up to their charge when he was going to his death. And he preached his first sermon that enkindled the heart of St. Paul. And that sermon entered into Saul of Tarsus, turned him into St. Paul, and wrote 14 epistles. Those 14 epistles came from the mouth of Saul of Tarsus, who had converted, but it came from the heart of Stephen. Stephen the deacon preached. He preached his word, and they stopped up their ears not to hear it. And they stopped, and they ran with great haste to throw Stephen to death. And they screamed with a loud voice, lest they not hear him. But he still heard to the end of the world, and every word that's spoken in the 14 epistles of St. Paul, and every word that converted the Gentiles, where's the origin of them? The heart and the mouth of the deacon Stephen. And what did he say? Lay not this sin to their charge, O Lord. And God heard his prayer because he loved Saul of Tarsus, the most wicked of them all. And his love of Saul caused God to say, all right, I'm going to make Saul into St. Paul. I'm going to turn him into a saint. So it is necessary for us to love our enemies. Does this love enter into the heart? It must enter now. Not on the day when we stand in front of the emperor. It must enter now. Do we love those that do evil to us? Do we make excuses for their sins? Do we look for their good? Do we love our enemies? Do we do good to those that hate us? These are the requirements of Christ and the preparation for martyrdom. And then when the time comes that there will be a great blessing, and God comes and God allows an emperor, a wicked man, filled with a fire of madness, which has all those other fires inside of them. And he will come with great madness to try to destroy the constancy of the followers of Christ, and they will fail. They will fail. There are martyrs in all ages, and there will be martyrs until the end of time. And we ask the grace to be counted amongst the martyrs. It is one of the most beautiful gift that God can give, but it is given only if we love. And so we ask the grace to really love and imitate the greatest of them all, the great martyr Lawrence, who was also with his great charity. He counted all the money. They say his job is to see. St. Peter has the keys in heaven. Lawrence takes care of the rupees. Judas failed in that job and he's burning in hell. St. Lawrence takes care of all the money. And it is said in heaven that every gift of charity, every time you give money to the poor, every time you give money away, Lawrence counts it. And there have been multiple miracles of souls that have died in the state of sin and gone to judgment. And Lawrence came to the judgment and said, here is some money that this man gave for the church of St. Lawrence. Here is the money that he gave unto the poor. And he put the gold on the scales. And the devils were weighing the scales on one side, and Lawrence took the scales on the other side and pushed it down, because there wasn't really that much gold in it. He pushed it down. And he said, all right, let this man go back to earth. Let him make penance for 30 days. Let him repent of his sins and come back to go to heaven. And Lawrence has interceded at the judgment of many a man. So there are many saints in heaven, but they are all loved by God, but not all hold exactly the same place. And Lawrence holds a most special place. The only saint outside of an apostle, the only saint that has a vigil, the only saint that this vigil is not a fast, but is simply a vigil, and the only saint who is in charge of all the money. And we're all supposed to give all that money. He knew the value of the treasures, and he burnt with the love of God in his heart, and that love must still stand in us in our times. Lawrence is still there to teach us the great deacon, and he knew the purpose of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. He was at that Mass. He never celebrated it. He put his fingers under the chalice for maybe 30 seconds, less than that, less than 30 seconds. He put his fingers under the chalice. And the flame of that power of touching the chalice with only the right hand, and for just a brief moment, and saying, "Let us offer the chalice of salvation," made him greater than so many saints, burned the fire of divine love inside of him, and made him the apostle of charity. So let's imitate the great Lawrence. And Sixtus the Pope, he turned and said, "I will be a saint, Saint Sixtus, and I am going to heaven. But I don't compare in any way to you, Lawrence. You are the greater warrior. You are the one who must die with a greater glory than I, and your glory shall last even greater than mine, longer than mine, but they both last forever, but in a brighter shiningness of the glory of Lawrence." In any case, we close with that. And God bless you all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.